At 11:24, the room laughed at the woman holding the quietest folder at the table. By sunrise, half the executive floor stopped answering calls, and the same timestamp everyone ignored had become the most expensive minute in the company's history. The conference room on the 32nd floor always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and expensive leather, as if stress itself had a corporate fragrance. Screens glowed across the walls with polished quarterly charts, green arrows, optimistic projections, and the kind of smiling numbers executives used like decorative plants. Outside the panoramic windows, rain slid down the glass in silver streaks, blurring the city into a watercolor of headlights and restless ambition. Elena sat halfway down the table with a slim gray binder resting beside her laptop. No gold lettering, no dramatic presentation, just tabs, notes, and a carefully maintained timestamp log that had consumed the last 6 weeks of her life. Most people in the room treated compliance the way travelers treated airplane safety cards: technically important, emotionally invisible. At exactly 11:24, the CFO leaned back in his chair and loosened his cufflinks with theatrical exhaustion. "Nobody cares about your documents." A few people chuckled automatically, not because the joke was clever, but because corporate gravity always pulled laughter toward power. Elena didn't react immediately. She simply looked at him for one measured second while the projector hummed softly behind him. The light cut across his polished watch like a blade. Then she lowered her eyes, clicked once on her laptop, and added a final entry into the compliance timestamp log. 11:24 a.m. Verbal dismissal of documented escalation during Q3 review. The keys sounded unusually loud. No one noticed, or worse, they noticed and decided it wasn't important. That distinction would matter later. A marketing director nearby whispered something under her breath. Another executive checked his phone beneath the table. Someone asked whether the revised launch campaign could still include the phrase "fully certified." Elena closed the binder carefully, not angrily, not dramatically, like a librarian returning a dangerous book to the shelf. And that calmness unsettled one person in the room more than the others. Martin Hale, head of operations, stopped tapping his pen. Only for a moment. Only long enough to realize she wasn't embarrassed. That was the strange part. Most employees shrank after public dismissal. They rushed to justify themselves, spoke too quickly, smiled too hard. But Elena gathered her notes with the composure of someone checking the weather before a storm she had already predicted. The CFO continued speaking, energized now, feeding on the room's attention. "We are not delaying certification again over procedural paranoia," he announced. "We move forward." Applause would have been too obvious, but several heads nodded with eager intensity. The company had spent millions preparing the product launch. Investors were impatient. Delays meant headlines. Headlines meant questions. Questions meant risk. And risk in executive culture was often treated like smoke in a hallway. If nobody acknowledged it, maybe it would disappear on its own. Elena slipped the gray binder into her bag. The rain outside intensified, tracing nervous patterns against the windows. Then her phone vibrated once, a message from an unknown internal extension. "Did you really log that comment?" She stared at the screen for half a second before locking the phone without replying. Someone in the building was paying attention. That mattered too. The meeting dragged on for another 40 minutes beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly artificial. Forecasts were revised, regional targets adjusted. Someone used the phrase aggressive scalability 3 separate times, as though repetition transformed nonsense into strategy. Elena remained silent, but silence in offices like this had layers. There was defeated silence, fearful silence, and then there was the silence of someone documenting everything. By noon, employees spilled into corridors carrying laptops and fragile confidence. The executive floor came alive with its usual choreography: hurried footsteps, elevator chimes, low political conversations near coffee machines. Elena walked through it all like a passenger moving underwater. Near the elevators, Martin Hale caught up to her. "You could have pushed harder in there," he muttered quietly. She pressed the elevator button once. "I already did." "That's not what I mean." "No," she said calmly. "I know." The elevator doors opened. For a brief second, reflected chrome stretched both their faces into distorted versions of themselves. Martin stepped inside beside her and lowered his voice further. "Listen carefully. They think certification review can be managed after release." Elena finally looked directly at him. "And what do you think?" The elevator descended in silence past glowing floor numbers. Martin exhaled slowly. "I think nobody upstairs has actually read Section 8. The doors opened again before she could answer. He walked away immediately, disappearing into legal operations without another word. But the tension he left behind lingered like static electricity. Elena returned to her office on the 17th floor, where the lighting was dimmer and the carpets less luxurious. Compliance departments rarely received architectural affection. Her workspace overlooked the neighboring building's concrete wall, interrupted only by a narrow slice of gray sky. Still, she preferred it. Quiet spaces made it easier to notice details, and details, unlike executives, rarely lied. She placed the binder on her desk and opened the timestamp archive. Hundreds of entries filled the screen: warnings, escalation attempts, unanswered review requests, delayed signatures. Every moment had been recorded with surgical precision. Across the office, her coworker Priya removed her glasses and stared carefully at Elena. "How bad was it?" Elena hung her coat neatly before answering. They laughed. Priya winced sympathetically. "That bad." "Elena," she paused, "you logged it?" A tiny smile touched Elena's face. "Of course." Priya leaned back slowly. The air conditioner rattled overhead like an old machine trying not to collapse. "You know what this means if the regulator audits before launch." Elena nodded once. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere above the city. Not dramatic thunder, distant thunder, the kind that sounded patient. Her inbox suddenly refreshed. A new notification appeared. Urgent. External regulatory follow-up request. The timestamp on the email read 11:31 a.m. Only 7 minutes after the CFO's comment. Elena opened it carefully. Her expression didn't change, but Priya noticed her fingers stop moving. "What?" Elena reread the message once before answering. "The regulator wants clarification on unresolved certification discrepancies." Priya sat upright immediately. "Today?" "Yes." The office suddenly felt smaller. Phones rang somewhere in the background. Printers whirred. A sales team laughed too loudly down the corridor, unaware the building's foundations had just developed invisible cracks. Elena closed the email. Then she opened the timestamp log again and added another entry. 11:38 a.m. Regulator inquiry received regarding previously escalated compliance discrepancy. Click, save. The sound landed like a chess piece touching the board before checkmate becomes visible. And somewhere upstairs, executives were still celebrating projections on a glowing screen, unaware that the quiet woman with the gray binder had already written down the exact moment the collapse officially began. If they had understood what those timestamps would soon cost them, the laughter at 11:24 would have died in their throats. By 6:10 that evening, the executive floor had transformed. The confidence was still there technically. The tailored jackets remained immaculate. The conference calls continued. Assistants still crossed hallways carrying tablets and carefully balanced coffees. But underneath the polished surface, something had shifted. Subtle at first, like a hairline fracture beneath ice. People had started lowering their voices. In large companies, panic never arrived running. It arrived whispering. Elena noticed it the moment she stepped out of the elevator, carrying her laptop bag and the same gray binder everyone had mocked hours earlier. Conversation stopped half a second too late when she walked past. Doors closed softly, eyes lingered. The regulator had sent a second request, this time marked formal review priority, and suddenly documents mattered. The CFO's assistant intercepted her near the glass corridor overlooking the city. "He wants to see you." "Now?" he said immediately. Of course he did. The irony almost made her smile. The sunset outside painted the skyline in bruised shades of orange and steel blue. Storm clouds hovered over the financial district, like an audience waiting for the third act of a tragedy everyone pretended not to recognize yet. Elena entered the executive conference room again. This morning, it had felt like a stage. Now it felt like a hospital waiting area. The CFO stood near the windows with his jacket removed, sleeves rolled up for visual effect, as though looking slightly disheveled could manufacture authenticity. Several executives sat around the table staring at printed compliance summaries they clearly did not understand. For the first time all day, nobody interrupted when Elena walked in. "Close the door," the CFO said. She did. A silence followed, thick, uncomfortable, expensive. Then came the softer voice, the dangerous one. "We received notice that the regulator may suspend product certification pending investigation." May corporate people loved temporary words, potential, possible, preliminary, terms designed to soften impact before impact arrived anyway. Elena placed her binder on the table without sitting. They requested clarification regarding unresolved Section 8 documentation inconsistencies. One executive adjusted his tie nervously. "Can't we just provide updated forms tonight?" "No." The answer landed instantly, too instantly. That bothered them. The CFO folded his arms. "You're saying there's no workaround?" Elena looked at him steadily beneath the cold white ceiling lights. "I'm saying the timestamp log already shows the discrepancies were identified before approval escalation." A pulse flickered in his jaw. The room fell silent again, because everyone there suddenly understood the same terrifying thing at once. There was now a documented timeline. Not opinions, not interpretations, not office politics, a timeline. And timelines were immune to charisma. Martin Hale entered 3 minutes later carrying additional printouts. His usually controlled expression looked sharpened by exhaustion. "They're asking for internal review records too," he said quietly. One executive muttered something under his breath. Another asked whether external counsel had been contacted. A third asked the only question that truly mattered. "Who else has access to the log?" Elena answered calmly. "Compliance archive, legal retention server, and automated regulator backup routing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, because deleting a document was one thing. Erasing a synchronized compliance timestamp system was another. The CFO walked slowly toward the table. "This is becoming disproportionate." Elena almost admired the sentence. Buildings could be on fire, and executives would still search for vocabulary gentle enough to protect quarterly optics. "With respect," she said evenly, "the regulator disagrees." His stare hardened. "You think this is some kind of victory?" There it was, the misunderstanding powerful people often made. They assumed documentation existed for revenge. Elena shook her head once. "No, I think this is procedure." Outside the windows, lightning flickered soundlessly behind distant towers. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Martin slid a printed sheet across the table toward the CFO. The man read it. His face changed almost imperceptibly, which somehow made it worse. "What is it?" someone asked. Martin answered instead. "The regulator already opened preliminary enforcement review at 4:42 p.m. A chair creaked loudly. Someone inhaled sharply. Another executive immediately reached for their phone. The CFO looked up slowly at Elena. "When were you planning to tell us?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time that day, Elena allowed herself the smallest trace of visible emotion: confusion. "I escalated the issue 3 times this month." No one replied, because she had receipts for that too. The projector screen still displayed revenue forecasts from the morning meeting. Bright, optimistic numbers glowed above a room, now calculating legal exposure instead of growth projections. It looked absurd, like decorating a sinking ship with sales awards. The CFO turned toward legal. What's our immediate exposure? Before legal could answer, Elena spoke quietly. Certification suspension pending review. The room froze again. Pending review. 3 words capable of vaporizing years of branding overnight. One executive suddenly stood. We should pause external launch communications immediately. Another disagreed. If we do that before formal notice, the market will panic. The market will panic more tomorrow. Voices overlapped. Tension rose. People who had ignored compliance 12 hours earlier were now arguing over terminology like surgeons debating bleeding rates beside an operating table. Elena stepped slightly away from the chaos, and in that moment, she noticed something strange. The CFO was watching her differently now, not dismissively, carefully, as though he had finally realized the quiet employee near the end of the table had become the single most dangerous witness in the building simply by doing her job correctly. Her phone vibrated again. Another regulator message, this one shorter, formal notice to follow. She read it once, locked the screen, then looked toward the rain-dark skyline beyond the windows. The city lights shimmered against wet glass like fractured signals underwater. Beautiful, cold, unforgiving. Martin noticed her expression. "What does it say?" Elena answered without drama. "The suspension notice is coming tonight." No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Then, almost unbelievably, the CFO laughed once under his breath. Not because anything was funny, because some people smiled automatically when standing too close to disaster. "This can still be contained," he said. Elena said nothing. Contained, another corporate word, like manageable, like isolated, like temporary. Meanwhile, somewhere inside secured regulator servers, time-stamped records were already aligning themselves into a narrative no executive could interrupt, charm, or outtalk. The meeting dissolved into frantic assignments after that. Legal drafted responses, communications prepared holding statements, operations began searching for undocumented shortcuts that no longer mattered. And through all of it, Elena remained calm. Not triumphant, not cruel, just calm. Because she understood something the others still resisted. Catastrophes rarely begin with explosions. Most begin with ignored emails, postponed meetings, and one sentence spoken too confidently in the wrong room at exactly the wrong minute. At 9:17 p.m., Elena finally packed her laptop. As she reached the door, the CFO spoke again behind her. "Why didn't you fight harder this morning?" She stopped. The hallway lights outside flickered softly against the glass walls. Then she answered without turning around. "I did." And somehow that quiet reply unsettled the room more than any regulator notice had so far. By midnight, the product certification suspension would become official. But the truly frightening part was this. The evidence proving they had been warned already existed long before anyone realized they should have listened. Somewhere inside the archive server, the timestamp log continued recording silently, minute after minute, like a clock patiently documenting the exact cost of arrogance. And before sunrise, one more name would appear inside that record. Would you have spoken up again after being dismissed at 11:24, or walked away and let the timeline speak for itself? Leave your answer below. The suspension notice arrived at 12:03 a.m., not with alarms, not with cinematic chaos, just a quiet, encrypted email delivered into several executive inboxes simultaneously, accompanied by the sterile precision of regulator formatting, black text, reference numbers, legal language sharp enough to cut through billions in valuation. Temporary suspension of product certification under Section 8 review. Elena read it alone in her apartment kitchen while the city slept beneath cold rain. The overhead light buzzed faintly above her, illuminating untouched tea beside the laptop screen. Outside, Kiev's streets reflected amber traffic lights across wet pavement like smeared gold leaf. She wasn't surprised, but surprise and impact were different things. Even expected disasters had weight once they officially arrived. Her phone began vibrating almost immediately. 3 missed calls, then 5, then 12. The CFO operations, legal, an unknown executive extension. She muted the device and continued reading the notice carefully line by line, the same way a surgeon studies scans before speaking to a family. Precision mattered now more than ever, especially now. The regulator wasn't accusing the company of intentional fraud. That would have been simpler. No, this was worse. The notice described systemic failure to properly address documented certification inconsistencies despite recorded internal escalation. Recorded internal escalation. A sentence built entirely from Elena's timestamp log. The irony settled over the room slowly, almost elegantly. For months, executives had treated compliance records like annoying office furniture, something unavoidable but fundamentally decorative. Now those same records had become the central nervous system of a federal review. Her screen lit up again. This time, a message from Priya. "Don't answer calls yet, legal is panicking." Elena stared at the words while rain tapped softly against the window. Then another message arrived seconds later. Someone accessed the archive at 11:48 p.m. That made her sit upright immediately, not because access itself was unusual, because of who had accessed it. Martin Hale. She checked the retention alerts again. Yes, operations executive credentials, archive retrieval request, timestamp export initiated, duration 14 minutes. Elena's expression tightened for the first time all night, because people only searched old records at midnight for two reasons. Either they were preparing a defense or searching for a weakness. A distant siren echoed through the city below. Her apartment suddenly felt colder. She opened the compliance backup server remotely and reviewed the mirrored log integrity reports. Every entry remained synchronized, every escalation preserved, no alterations, no deletions. Still, her instincts sharpened. Something was moving inside the company now, fast, frightened, and mostly invisible. And fear inside executive structures behaved like electricity during storms, unpredictable, dangerous, looking desperately for somewhere to ground itself. At 7:12 the next morning, the office lobby resembled an airport during severe weather delays. Employees clustered near elevators clutching coffees they forgot to drink. Security staff spoke into earpieces. News alerts flashed across phones. Someone from communications was crying quietly near the reception desk while pretending to review spreadsheets. The building itself felt different, not physically, emotionally. Like a theater moments after smoke appears backstage. Elena walked through the revolving doors carrying her gray binder again. This time, people moved aside for her. Funny how authority changed shape during crises. Yesterday, she had been background noise. Today, she was the person connected to the one thing nobody could control anymore, the documented timeline. As the elevator climbed, she noticed conversations stopping around her. A compliance analyst avoided eye contact entirely. Two legal associates whispered behind tablets. Someone murmured, "That's her." Not with admiration, not exactly fear either, more like the cautious attention people gave to smoke detectors after smelling fire. When the elevator opened on 32, the executive floor no longer resembled power. It resembled damage control. Conference room doors stood open, half-finished coffees littered desks. Whiteboards filled with legal terminology covered walls that usually displayed revenue strategies. The CFO emerged from his office the moment he saw her. He looked older than he had yesterday. Not dramatically older, just deflated around the edges, like confidence had lost air overnight. "We need to talk." No greeting, no performance. Interesting. Elena followed him into the conference room, where Martin and two legal advisors already waited. The giant screen displayed regulator correspondence instead of financial projections now. Another symbolic shift. The room smelled sharply of stale espresso and panic. Martin slid a folder across the table. "We reviewed the escalation chain." Elena didn't sit. "And?" A legal advisor adjusted her glasses carefully. "There's concern regarding procedural interpretation." There it was, the first attempt to soften accountability through vocabulary. Elena opened the folder calmly. Inside were printed copies of her own timestamp entries highlighted in yellow. 11 separate escalations, 3 ignored review requests, 2 delayed compliance meetings, 1 executive override authorization, and highlighted more heavily than the others, 11:24 a.m., verbal dismissal of documented escalation during Q3 review. The CFO spoke carefully now, each word measured like someone crossing thin ice. That particular wording may create reputational complications. Elena looked up slowly. It reflects what happened. Yes, but… No, she interrupted quietly. It reflects what happened. Silence spread across the room again. Legal teams hated factual people during crises. Facts lacked flexibility. Martin leaned forward. The regulator is asking whether executive leadership knowingly proceeded despite unresolved discrepancies. No one breathed for a second, because now the danger had evolved. This was no longer about certification delays. This was about awareness, knowledge, documentation, intent. And intent lived or died through records exactly like the ones Elena maintained. Outside the conference room, footsteps moved rapidly through corridors. Phones rang nonstop. Somewhere nearby, a printer continuously spat out legal drafts like a machine producing anxiety in paper form. The CFO rubbed his forehead slowly. What do they actually want? Elena answered immediately. Proof the company attempted corrective action before release authorization. The legal advisor spoke carefully. And can we provide that? Elena closed the folder. No. The simplicity of the answer landed harder than shouting ever could. Martin looked toward the window. Rain clouds still hung low over the skyline, turning morning light metallic and cold. Then he asked the question nobody else wanted to ask aloud. Who approved proceeding despite the unresolved Section 8 flags? No one answered, because everyone already knew. The CFO's silence became its own document, and suddenly Elena understood why Martin had accessed the archive the night before, not to erase records, to confirm survival odds. A notification appeared on the conference room screen. Live industry news alert. One of the legal associates clicked it instinctively. The headline appeared instantly. Regulator suspends certification review for major product launch. No company name yet, but that protection would not last long. The room darkened emotionally in an instant, like sunlight disappearing behind storm clouds. The CFO stood abruptly. We issue a controlled statement before markets open. And say what? Martin asked. That we're cooperating. Elena almost smiled at the predictability of it. Cooperating. Another elegant corporate word often used when events had already escaped control. The CFO turned toward her again. From this point forward, all regulator communication goes through legal. There it was. Not blame. Not yet. Containment. The instinctive executive reflex to place walls around the person holding the clearest timeline. Elena met his stare evenly, as required by procedure. That answer irritated him more than resistance would have. Because procedure was neutral, and neutrality made retaliation dangerous. Her laptop vibrated softly, a new regulator request. She opened it, read silently, then looked back up. What now? Martin asked quietly. Elena closed the screen. They want preserved recordings from yesterday's Q3 review. The room froze completely. Every sound outside the conference room suddenly seemed distant, muted. Even the city beyond the windows looked motionless beneath the rain, because everyone at that table remembered the same sentence at the same time. Nobody cares about your documents. And for the first time since the crisis began, the CFO looked genuinely afraid. By 10:40 a.m., the company's internal chat system had become a digital thunderstorm. Messages flashed faster than people could process them. Legal requests, emergency calendar invites, security confirmations, conflicting instructions written in polished corporate language that barely concealed panic underneath. Do not discuss regulatory review externally. Preserve all certification communications. Mandatory executive meeting, 11:15. Someone in marketing accidentally replied, all with, "Are we delaying launch?" or pretending we're not delaying launch. The message vanished 30 seconds later. Too late. Screenshots had already spread through 3 departments. Elena sat quietly at her desk reviewing preservation protocols while the office around her vibrated with controlled hysteria. Rain still pressed against the windows in soft gray sheets, trapping the building inside a muted world of fluorescent light and anxiety. Across from her, Priya lowered her voice. People are saying recordings from the Q3 review disappeared for 20 minutes overnight. Elena stopped typing. Who said that? IT retention. A slow silence followed. Then Elena locked her screen carefully. Because missing recordings changed everything. Documents could be argued, emails could be contextualized, but missing footage created questions large enough to swallow careers whole. When? Between 1:12 and 1:34 a.m.? Priya hesitated. And guess who requested server access authorization? Elena already knew before hearing the answer. The CFO? Priya nodded once. The air conditioner rattled overhead again, like an exhausted machine struggling to survive another quarter. Outside the compliance department, footsteps moved rapidly through hallways. Somewhere nearby, someone raised their voice during a phone call before immediately lowering it again. Fear in corporate buildings always tried to stay professionally formatted. Elena reopened the archive system. The retention logs confirmed it. Restricted access attempt, media retrieval request, partial interruption in mirrored backup sync. Her expression hardened slightly. Not emotional, mathematical, because attempted retrieval meant someone had finally understood the real danger. It wasn't the regulator, not entirely, it was the sequence. The clean, irreversible sequence connecting warnings, dismissals, timestamps, and executive awareness into a timeline no public relations statement could soften. At 11:13, Elena received another message from legal. Mandatory attendance required, 32nd floor. Of course, the elevator ride upward felt longer than usual. No one spoke. Employees stared at illuminated floor numbers while pretending not to observe one another's expressions. 28, 29, 30? A junior analyst stepped out abruptly before reaching executive level, visibly relieved to escape. Cowardice and self-preservation often wore identical clothing in corporations. When Elena entered the main conference room, she immediately noticed the difference. Yesterday, people had been worried. Today, they were choosing sides. The long glass table had become invisible territory divided by posture, eye contact, and silence. Legal occupied one side, operations another. Communications remained clustered near the far end, like passengers seated too close to turbulence. And at the head of the table sat the CFO, rigid beneath the cold glow of recessed lighting. No jokes today, no theatrical confidence, just controlled damage. Martin Hale stood near the screen displaying retention logs and regulatory timelines. His tie hung slightly crooked now, the first visible crack in a man usually engineered from discipline. "We have a problem," he began quietly. No one appreciated the understatement. He clicked the remote. A security report appeared. Attempted media archive access. Executive authorization requested. Timestamp 1:12 a.m. Denied by automated retention safeguard. The room remained still. Then all eyes moved toward the CFO. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "That request was misunderstood," he said immediately. Legal didn't look convinced. Neither did Martin. Elena said nothing. Sometimes silence forced truth into the room faster than accusations ever could. The CFO leaned forward. The intention was to review internal meeting context before regulator submission. "By interrupting retention synchronization?" one legal advisor asked. "It was not interrupted intentionally." "Not intentionally," another carefully selected phrase. The conference room windows trembled faintly as wind pushed rain harder against the building. The skyline beyond looked blurred and distant, as though the city itself preferred not to witness what was happening inside. Martin clicked to the next slide. Q3 review recording status. Partial recovery successful. A quiet exhale moved through the room, but only briefly, because underneath the status line appeared another sentence. Audio integrity verification pending. The CFO's expression changed again. Tiny, but Elena noticed. Fear was becoming visible now in microscopic ways. Tightened shoulders, unfinished sentences, eyes lingering too long on legal counsel. Executives rarely collapsed dramatically. Usually they leaked confidence slowly, like pressure escaping damaged steel. One communications director spoke nervously. If audio verification fails, what exactly does the regulator assume? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Elena did. They assume preservation risk. The room absorbed that phrase heavily. Preservation risk, cold words, deadly implications, because regulators became extremely interested whenever records appeared unstable after investigations began, especially recordings connected to executive meetings. The CFO stood suddenly and walked toward the windows. Rainwater streaked across the glass behind him like distorted bar graphs collapsing downward. This entire situation is spiraling because one procedural concern escalated out of proportion. Elena finally looked directly at him. No, she said calmly. It escalated because the concern existed. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even Martin closed his eyes briefly. For one suspended moment, the room seemed balanced on invisible wires. Then a notification sound broke the silence. Legal had received updated regulator correspondence. Everyone turned. The attorney opened the message slowly, read silently, then went pale. What? The CFO demanded. The attorney swallowed once. They are requesting individual executive communication records connected to certification discussions. Nobody moved. Somewhere outside the room, a phone rang unanswered, then rang again. The CFO laughed once under his breath, the same dangerous reflex he'd shown before, but now it sounded thinner, almost brittle. This is becoming absurd. Elena thought about the timestamp log sitting safely inside mirrored retention systems across 3 secure archives. Calm little entries, tiny records, simple facts. And yet those facts were now dragging an entire executive structure into open daylight, one documented minute at a time. Martin looked toward Elena carefully. Were there any verbal escalations not reflected in the written chain? Interesting question. Not whether she had warned them, whether she had warned them more than documented. Elena answered honestly, yes. The room tightened immediately, but every formal escalation was recorded. That distinction mattered. A lot. Legal began speaking rapidly after that, discussing preservation obligations, external review protocols, risk exposure. Sentences overlapped, strategies collided, people interrupted each other with increasing desperation, disguised as professionalism. Meanwhile, Elena noticed something strange near the end of the table. The marketing director from yesterday, the one who had laughed quietly after the CFO's comment, could no longer meet her eyes. Guilt had entered the room now. Not legal guilt, human guilt. The slower kind. The kind that arrived when people realized they had mistaken calm competence for weakness because it spoke softly. At 12:42 p.m., Martin's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. His face lost color immediately. What happened? Someone asked. He looked toward the CFO before answering. The regulator wants in-person executive interviews. Complete silence. No typing, no movement. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, because interviews meant something psychologically devastating for leadership teams. The situation had officially evolved beyond paperwork. Now people themselves would become evidence. And suddenly everyone in that conference room understood the same terrifying reality Elena had recognized weeks ago, while quietly updating timestamp entries beneath fluorescent lights no one respected. Documentation was never the danger. The danger was what documentation revealed about people once the lights finally turned on. The rain stopped sometime after midnight. Not dramatically, no thunder, no cinematic clearing of clouds. The storm simply exhausted itself over the city and disappeared, leaving behind wet streets that reflected dawn in fractured silver lines. By 6:45 a.m., the executive floor already smelled of stale coffee, overheated electronics, and sleeplessness. Elena stepped out of the elevator carrying the same gray binder she had carried all week. It looked almost absurd now, thin, quiet, ordinary, like something forgotten in a printer room, yet entire careers were orbiting around it. Inside the conference suite, preparation for regulator interviews was underway with the tense choreography of emergency surgery. Legal teams moved between rooms carrying annotated timelines and preservation summaries. Assistants whispered through headsets. Someone had replaced the decorative flowers near reception with bottled water and stacks of confidentiality forms. That detail stayed with Elena strangely. Crisis always removed decoration first. Martin stood near the windows, reviewing interview schedules when she entered. "You're early," he said quietly. "So are you." He gave a tired half smile. Neither mentioned the obvious. Nobody in leadership had gone home. The skyline outside looked washed clean after the storm, pale morning light spreading across towers still glowing from overnight office lamps. Somewhere far below, commuters crossed intersections unaware that one of the largest product launches of the year had effectively collapsed in slow motion behind mirrored glass. Martin lowered his voice. The CFO barely slept. Elena placed her binder on the table. "That's unfortunate." The dryness of the answer almost surprised him. Not cruel, just honest. For weeks, she had slept beside unresolved escalation notices while executives postponed meetings and called compliance timing noise. Exhaustion had simply changed departments now. Before Martin could respond, legal opened the main conference doors. "They're here." Conversation across the floor stopped instantly, not because regulators were loud, quite the opposite. Three people entered calmly carrying tablets and thin black folders. No intimidation tactics, no raised voices, just precise attention, the bureaucratic equivalent of surgical instruments. And somehow, that composure frightened everyone more. The lead investigator introduced herself briefly before reviewing preservation obligations. Her tone remained professional, almost gentle, which made the tension in the room unbearable, because panic looked ridiculous beside calm authority. Interviews began at 8 o'clock sharp. One by one, executives disappeared into private rooms behind frosted glass walls. One by one, they emerged quieter. Some avoided eye contact afterward, some immediately called attorneys. One vice president locked himself in an empty office for 20 minutes, pretending to take a conference call. Meanwhile, Elena sat in a secondary review room, organizing escalation records chronologically. Timestamp after timestamp stretched across the table like railway tracks, leading inevitably toward impact. 11:24 a.m., verbal dismissal of documented escalation during Q3 review. She paused briefly at that line, not emotionally, observationally. Amazing how one careless sentence could become architectural damage once attached to evidence. Her interview began at 10:16. The regulator's questions were direct. Who identified the discrepancies? When were they escalated? Who acknowledged receipt? Were corrective actions initiated? Elena answered carefully, calmly, factually. No embellishment. No revenge hidden between words. Just procedure. At one point, the investigator glanced up from the tablet. "You maintained the timestamp log personally?" "Yes." "And all entries were recorded contemporaneously?" "Yes." Another pause. Then the investigator asked something unexpected. "Why continue escalating after repeated dismissal?" For the first time all morning, Elena hesitated slightly. Outside the room, blurred figures moved beyond the frosted glass walls like shadows underwater. Finally, she answered, Because the documentation was true. The investigator studied her quietly for a moment before nodding once and continuing. No dramatic reaction, no visible sympathy. But the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly after that. Respect had entered it. When the interview concluded, Elena stepped back into the executive corridor and immediately sensed something had changed. Not panic this time, resignation, the kind that settles slowly over people when they realize outcomes are no longer negotiable. The CFO stood alone near the windows overlooking the city. His tie was gone entirely now, shirt sleeves rolled unevenly, eyes hollow from 2 nights without real sleep. For several seconds, neither spoke. Morning sunlight finally pierced through retreating clouds, casting pale gold across the glass walls and polished floors. The office looked beautiful again in that dangerous corporate way, clean surfaces hiding structural damage underneath. Then the CFO exhaled quietly. I should have listened. The sentence almost disappeared into the room. No performance, no strategy, just exhaustion stripped down to truth. Elena looked toward the skyline instead of at him. Yes, she said softly. Strangely, that hurt him more than anger would have, because calm acknowledgement left nowhere to argue. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. Do you know what legal thinks happens now? She already did, but she let him continue. They think the regulator may allow recertification if we demonstrate procedural reform and executive accountability. Executive accountability? Another elegant phrase, but unlike the others, this one carried consequences. Somewhere behind conference room doors, attorneys were already discussing resignations, restructuring, public statements, internal reviews. The machinery of corporate survival had begun reorganizing itself around sacrifice points. And for the first time all week, Elena felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, relief. The exhausting pressure of carrying ignored warnings had finally ended. Truth no longer depended on whether powerful people acknowledged it. The record existed independently now, solid and unavoidable. Her phone vibrated once. A company-wide email notification, interim operations announcement. She opened it silently. The message confirmed temporary suspension of the product launch, pending regulatory cooperation, and internal review restructuring. Near the bottom appeared another line. Chief Financial Officer Adrian Cross has taken immediate administrative leave effective today. No dramatic farewell, no golden language, just absence converted into policy formatting. The CFO closed his eyes briefly after realizing she had read it. I suppose that's it. Elena thought about the Q3 meeting. The laughter, the polished table, the casual arrogance floating through fluorescent light at exactly 11:24. Then she thought about the timestamp log quietly recording everything while nobody paid attention. No, she said calmly, that was it. He understood immediately. Not today. Not the suspension. Not the investigation. The real ending had happened the moment leadership confused silence with weakness and documentation with inconvenience. A cleaning crew moved quietly through the corridor, replacing coffee cups and empty water bottles. Ordinary maintenance continuing beside extraordinary collapse. There was something almost poetic about that. Corporations like to imagine disasters arrived like explosions. In reality, most ended with paperwork. At noon, Elena returned to her office on the 17th floor for the first uninterrupted moment in days. The rain clouds were finally gone, allowing sunlight to spill across her desk in warm rectangular shapes. Priya leaned against the doorway, holding 2 coffees. So, she asked carefully, how does it feel being right? Elena accepted the cup. The steam curled upward between them softly. Then she looked toward the narrow strip of blue sky visible beyond the neighboring concrete building. And after everything, the dismissals, the regulator action, the sleepless nights, the collapsing certainty upstairs, her answer remained almost impossibly simple. Tiring, Priya laughed quietly. Not nervous laughter this time, real laughter, the kind people shared after surviving something heavy together. Outside, the city continued moving beneath fresh sunlight and drying streets, indifferent as ever to executive titles, quarterly forecasts, or vanished confidence. But deep inside secured archive servers, untouched by ego or panic or reputation management, the timestamp log remained preserved exactly as it had always been, minute by minute, fact by fact, a silent reminder that truth did not need volume to become devastating.